Chapter 1: The Helpful Ranger. The Blackwood National Forest had always been known for its pristine wilderness and excellent camping facilities, but what drew visitors back year after year was Ranger Williams. For as long as anyone could remember, he'd been the friendly face greeting families at the entrance, offering helpful advice about trail conditions and wildlife safety. He seemed to know every inch of the forest's 50,000 acres, and locals often joked that he'd been there since the park opened in 1963. The joke was closer to truth than anyone realized. Danny Martinez was 17 when his family first encountered Ranger Williams during their annual camping trip in the summer of 1987. The ranger appeared at their campsite just as they were finishing dinner, emerging from the darkening forest with the silent grace of someone who'd spent decades moving through wilderness. "Evening, folks," Williams said, his voice carrying that familiar authority that made people instinctively trust park officials. "Mind if I check your permits and give you a few safety reminders?" Danny's father, Roberto, handed over their paperwork while Danny's mother, Carmen, began clearing dishes. Danny himself was more interested in the ranger's appearance than his bureaucratic duties. Williams looked to be in his 40s, with silver gray hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. But his eyes were strange, almost colorless, and they seemed to reflect the campfire light in ways that weren't quite natural. "Beautiful family," Williams observed, studying the permits with unusual attention. "Just the three of you?" "That's right," Roberto replied. "Danny here just graduated high school. This is our celebration trip before he heads off to college." Williams nodded thoughtfully, his pale eyes lingering on Danny in a way that made the teenager uncomfortable. "College. That's wonderful. Where will you be attending?" "University of Colorado," Danny said, trying to keep the pride out of his voice. "Ah, Boulder. Lovely area. Very. Isolated once you get into the backcountry." Williams handed the permits back to Roberto, but continued to study the family with that unsettling intensity. "You folks planning to do any night hiking?" "Some of our best wildlife viewing happens after dark." Carmen shook her head quickly. "We prefer to stay close to camp once the sun goes down." "Probably wise," Williams agreed, though something in his tone suggested disappointment. "These mountains can be dangerous for the unprepared. Easy to get turned around, lose your way. Some folks venture out for what they think will be a short evening stroll and are never seen again." The way he said it sent a chill down Danny's spine, not the casual warning of a concerned park official, but something that sounded almost like anticipation. "Have there been many disappearances?" Roberto asked. Williams smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too white and too perfectly aligned. "Oh, over the years, quite a few. Usually inexperienced hikers who ignore posted warnings and venture into restricted areas. The forest has a way of claiming those who don't respect its boundaries." He gestured toward the darkness beyond their campfire's reach, where the ancient pines formed walls of impenetrable shadow. "There are places out there that haven't been properly mapped, ravines and cave systems that go deeper than our survey equipment can measure. A person could fall into one of those and simply disappear." Danny noticed that Williams never blinked, not once during the entire conversation. His pale eyes remained fixed and unmoving, like those of a predator studying potential prey. "Well, we'll be sure to stay on marked trails," Carmen said, clearly eager to end the conversation. "Of course," Williams replied, "but if you do decide to explore after dark, I'm usually doing rounds until quite late. I know all the safe routes, all the places where the forest reveals its true beauty. I'd be happy to serve as a guide." "That's very kind," Roberto said, "but I think we'll stick to daytime activities." Williams nodded, but his smile never wavered. "Understood. Well, I should continue my rounds. Enjoy your stay, and remember, if you need anything at all, just call out." The forest carries sound much farther than you might expect. He melted back into the darkness as silently as he'd arrived, leaving the Martinez family alone with their fire and a growing sense of unease that none of them could quite articulate. That night, Danny was awakened by sounds outside their tent, footsteps circling their campsite, moving with deliberate slowness. Through the thin nylon walls, he could see a shadow passing back and forth, pausing occasionally as if studying the sleeping family within. "Dad," Danny whispered, but Roberta was snoring softly, apparently undisturbed by whatever was prowling outside. The footsteps continued for nearly an hour, sometimes approaching so close to the tent that Danny could hear breathing that didn't sound quite human. Too deep, too controlled, with odd whistling sounds on the exhales. When morning came, Danny found footprints in the soft earth around their campsite. Human-shaped, but larger than any he'd ever seen, with claw marks at the tips that suggested the ranger's boots had been modified in some disturbing way. The Martinez family cut their trip short that day, claiming sudden illness, though all three were perfectly healthy. As they drove away from Blackwood, Danny looked back to see Ranger Williams standing at the forest's edge, watching their departure with those pale, unblinking eyes. Years later, when Danny heard about other families who'd encountered the helpful ranger and later experienced missing member incidents, he would remember that night and wonder if Williams had been deciding which one of them to take. Chapter 2: The Knowledgeable Guide. In 1993, the Thompsons arrived at Blackwood for what they planned to be a week-long wilderness photography expedition. Mark Thompson was a freelance nature photographer whose work had appeared in several national magazines, while his wife Sarah documented their adventures for a travel blog that was gaining popularity in the early days of the internet. Ranger Williams found them on their second day, appearing at their remote campsite with his characteristic silent approach and unsettling smile. "Photographing wildlife, I see," Williams observed, examining Mark's expensive camera equipment with obvious interest. "Looking for anything in particular?" "We heard there might be wolves in this area," Mark replied, adjusting his telephoto lens. "Haven't been confirmed sightings in Colorado for decades, but there have been rumors." William's pale eyes seemed to brighten at the mention of wolves. "Oh, there are definitely predators in these mountains, creatures that most people never see, never even suspect exist. The question is whether you're prepared to encounter them." Sarah looked up from her laptop where she'd been writing about their first day's experiences. "What kind of creatures?" "Ancient things," Williams said, settling onto a fallen log as if he planned to stay for a while. "Species that predate human settlement of this region. The native tribes had stories about them, warnings passed down through generations about things that hunted in the deep forest." He gestured toward the tree line where shadows seemed to move despite the absence of wind. "They say these mountains are thin places, where the boundaries between worlds grow weak. Sometimes things slip through that don't belong in our reality." Mark lowered his camera, intrigued despite himself. "You sound like you believe those stories." "I've been working these woods for longer than most people realize," Williams replied. "You see things, hear things, find evidence of activity that doesn't match any known species. Tracks that are almost human, but not quite. Sounds that might be animal calls, but contain patterns that suggest intelligence." Sarah was typing furiously, documenting what she assumed was colorful local folklore. "Have you ever actually seen one of these creatures?" Williams was quiet for a long moment, his unblinking gaze fixed on some point beyond their campsite. "Once, about 10 years ago, I was tracking a missing hiker deep in the restricted zones. Found signs of a struggle, equipment scattered, but no body." He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Then I saw it, Tall as a man but wrong somehow. Limbs that bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. Skin that seemed to shift and change texture as I watched. And the face. What about the face? Mark asked, despite himself. It was wearing the missing hiker's face, not like a mask, but as if it had somehow absorbed his features, made them part of itself. When it saw me watching, it smiled with his mouth and spoke with his voice. William stood abruptly, his demeanor shifting back to professional courtesy. Of course, that was just my imagination. Stress, fatigue, tricks of light and shadow. The official report listed it as a bare encounter, but something in his tone suggested he didn't believe his own dismissal, and both Mark and Sarah found themselves glancing nervously at the surrounding forest. If you're serious about photographing the local wildlife, Williams continued, I could show you some areas where unusual activity has been reported, places where you might capture something truly unique. Mark's professional instincts warred with his growing unease. The promise of unprecedented wildlife footage was tempting, but there was something about Ranger Williams that set off every alarm bell in his subconscious. These restricted areas you mentioned, Sarah said carefully, are they dangerous? Only if you're not properly prepared, Williams replied, but I know the safe routes, the places where you can observe without being observed. The creatures I've seen, they're very sensitive to human presence. Most people stumble around making noise, scaring everything away before they have a chance to see anything interesting. He moved closer to their equipment, examining it with the expertise of someone who understood photography. With your telephoto capabilities, we could position you at a safe distance. You'd get your shots, and the subjects would never know they were being watched. When would we go? Mark asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Tonight, Williams said immediately. The activity is most intense after dark, when most predators do their hunting. I could meet you at the trailhead around midnight, guide you to a location where recent sightings have been reported. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, her earlier enthusiasm for the adventure clearly waning. I don't think that's a good idea. Night photography in unfamiliar terrain sounds dangerous. Sarah's right, Mark agreed, though his tone suggested reluctance. Maybe we could try during daylight hours first? Williams nodded, but his smile seemed forced. Of course, safety first, but I should mention that several other photographers have expressed interest in documenting these phenomena. If you're not ready to take advantage of this opportunity, I'm sure someone else would be. The subtle pressure tactic worked exactly as Williams had intended. Mark's competitive instincts kicked in, overriding his better judgment. Actually, maybe we could try a short expedition, just for an hour or two. Excellent, Williams said, his pale eyes gleaming with what might have been satisfaction. I'll meet you at the old logging road entrance at midnight. Bring your best low-light equipment. After he left, Sarah and Mark spent the rest of the day debating whether to keep their appointment. Sarah's instincts screamed danger, while Mark was consumed with visions of career-making photographs. In the end, professional ambition won out over common sense. At 11:30 p.m., they packed their gear and headed for the rendezvous point, neither of them noticing the pale eyes that watched their departure from the shadows beyond their campsite. When the sun rose the next morning, their tent was found empty, their remaining equipment scattered as if they'd left in great haste. A search party found no trace of Mark and Sarah Thompson, though several searchers reported finding strange tracks near the old logging road that didn't match any known animal. Ranger Williams led the search effort with apparent dedication, his pale eyes showing appropriate concern as he explained to the authorities that the couple had ignored his warnings about night hiking in dangerous terrain. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. Chapter 3: The Patient Predator. By 1998, Ranger Williams had perfected his approach, He no longer relied on chance encounters or elaborate stories about mysterious creatures. Instead, he had learned to identify the perfect targets and cultivate them with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The Hendersons were exactly what he was looking for, an isolated family with minimal connections to the outside world. Jim Henderson was recently divorced, struggling to maintain a relationship with his 16-year-old daughter Kelly during their court-mandated weekend visits. They'd chosen Blackwood specifically because it was remote enough to avoid running into anyone from their hometown. Williams observed them for 2 days before making contact, studying their routines and dynamics with the calculating attention of a behavioral scientist. He noted that Jim was desperate to prove himself as a caring father, while Kelly was sullen and resentful about the forced family time. After noon, Williams said, approaching their campsite during the hottest part of the day when both father and daughter were seeking shade. "Noticed you folks have been here a few days. Everything going well?" Jim looked up from the camping guide he'd been consulting, clearly grateful for adult conversation. "Getting by. Still learning the ropes, I'm afraid." "First time camping?" Williams asked, though he already knew the answer. "With my daughter, yes. Used to do a lot of outdoors stuff when I was younger, but..." Jim trailed off, unwilling to discuss his personal situation with a stranger. Williams nodded understandingly. Divorce can be tough on family traditions, but camping is a great way to reconnect, get away from all the distractions of modern life. Kelly looked up from her book with obvious irritation. "There's nothing wrong with modern life. I'd rather be at home with my friends." "I felt the same way at your age," Williams said with a sympathetic smile. "Thought my parents were torturing me by dragging me into the wilderness, but some of my best memories come from those trips." He settled onto a nearby rock, positioning himself where he could observe both father and daughter, while appearing casual and non-threatening. "What changed your mind?" Jim asked. "Seeing things that most people never get to experience," Williams replied. "The forest at night is completely different from the daytime version. There's wildlife that only emerges after dark, sounds and sights that most campers miss because they're locked up in their tents." Kelly showed the first spark of genuine interest he'd seen from her. "What kind of wildlife?" "Creatures that have learned to avoid human contact during the day. Some of them are quite remarkable, almost alien in their behavior. I've been documenting them for years as part of my research." Williams reached into his pocket and withdrew a small photograph, handling it as if it were precious. The image was blurry and indistinct, showing what might have been a large animal moving through dense forest, but the details were impossible to make out clearly. "What is it?" Kelly asked, leaning closer to examine the photograph. "I'm not entirely sure," Williams admitted. "Something I've been tracking for years. It only appears in this area, always at night, always alone. The behavior patterns don't match any known species." Jim studied the photograph with growing excitement. "You think it might be an undiscovered animal?" "Possibly. Or something that was thought to be extinct." Williams carefully returned the photograph to his pocket. "The problem is getting close enough for better documentation. It's extremely sensitive to human presence." "How do you study it then?" Kelly asked. "Very carefully. I've spent years learning its habits, figuring out where it's likely to appear and when. There are certain locations where sightings are more common, usually near water sources or natural clearings." Williams paused, as if reaching a difficult decision. "Actually, there's a spot about 2 miles from here where I've had the most success. If you're interested in seeing some genuine wilderness mystery." "Could we go tonight?" Kelly asked, her earlier sullenness replaced by curiosity. Jim hesitated, torn between his desire to please his daughter and his paternal instincts. "Is it safe?" "With proper precautions, absolutely," Williams assured him. "I know the terrain intimately, and I always carry emergency equipment. The biggest risk is disappointment if the creature doesn't show up. What kind of precautions? Jim asked. We'd need to approach the area very quietly, position ourselves downwind, and be prepared to wait for several hours. The creature is most active between midnight and dawn. Kelly grabbed her father's arm. Please, Dad, this is way more interesting than sitting around the campsite. Jim found himself nodding despite his reservations. Kelly hadn't shown this much enthusiasm about anything since they'd arrived, and he was desperate to salvage their weekend together. All right, he said, but we follow the ranger's lead completely. No wandering off, no unnecessary risks. Excellent, Williams said, his pale eyes reflecting the afternoon sunlight in ways that seemed almost metallic. I'll meet you here at 11 p.m. Dress warmly and bring flashlights, but be prepared to use them sparingly. Too much artificial light will scare off anything interesting. After Williams left, Jim spent the rest of the day second-guessing his decision while Kelly counted the hours until their midnight expedition. Neither of them noticed that their campsite was being watched from multiple angles, pale eyes tracking their every movement with predatory patience. At 11 p.m. sharp, Williams appeared with the punctuality of someone whose entire existence revolved around careful timing. He was carrying a large backpack and what appeared to be scientific equipment, lending credibility to his claims about research and documentation. Ready for an adventure? He asked, his smile revealing those two perfect teeth. Kelly nodded eagerly while Jim checked and rechecked their emergency supplies. As they set off into the darkness, following Williams along paths that didn't appear on any official park map, none of them heard the soft sound of their campsite being methodically searched by something that moved on limbs that bent in directions human joints couldn't accommodate. The creature that wore Ranger Williams' face was preparing for the final phase of a hunt that had been planned with the patience of something that measured time in decades rather than days. Chapter 4. The Collector. Sheriff Davidson arrived at Blackwood National Forest on September 15th, 2003, with a growing file of missing persons reports and a suspicion that the coincidences were adding up to something more sinister than random wilderness accidents. Over the past 40 years, 37 people had vanished within the forest boundaries, all under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Ranger Williams met him at the park entrance with the same helpful demeanor he'd shown countless visitors over the decades. But Davidson had learned to look beyond surface appearances during his 20 years in law enforcement. "Sheriff," Williams said, extending a hand that felt unnaturally cold despite the warm September weather. "I understand you have some questions about our missing persons cases." 37 people in 40 years, Davidson replied, studying Williams' pale, unblinking eyes. "That's a pretty high number for a forest this size." Williams nodded gravely. "Wilderness can be unforgiving to the unprepared. Most of our disappearances involve hikers who ignore posted warnings or venture into restricted areas without proper equipment." "But no bodies," Davidson observed. "In 40 years of searching, you've never found a single body." "The terrain is challenging," Williams explained. "Deep ravines, underground river systems, areas where someone could fall and simply vanish. We do our best with search and rescue, but sometimes the forest keeps its secrets." Davidson consulted his notes, cross-referencing dates and circumstances. "What interests me is the pattern. Most of the disappearances happen during certain moon phases, usually when families or small groups are camping in remote areas." Williams' expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those colorless eyes. "I hadn't noticed any particular pattern. Could you elaborate?" "New moon periods, when the nights are darkest, and almost all the missing persons were last seen after encounters with park personnel offering to guide them to areas of special interest." "Are you suggesting that someone on my staff is involved in these disappearances?" Williams asked, his tone carrying just the right note of professional offense. "I'm investigating all possibilities," Davidson replied, "which is why I'd like to review your personnel records, see who's been working here during the relevant time periods." Williams was quiet for a long moment, as if considering how to respond. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, something that suggested vast patience stretched to its breaking point. "Sheriff, I've been the chief ranger here since the park opened in 1963. In all that time, I've dedicated my life to protecting visitors and preserving this wilderness. The suggestion that I or my staff might be responsible for these tragedies is deeply insulting." Davidson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Since 1963? That would make you older than I look," Williams finished with a smile that revealed too many teeth. "Mountain air and clean living. Very good for preserving one's vitality." The sheriff studied Williams more carefully, noting details he'd missed during their initial meeting. The ranger's skin had an odd texture, almost waxy in appearance. His hair showed no sign of thinning or graying at the roots. Most disturbing of all, Davidson realized he hadn't seen Williams blink once during their entire conversation. "I'd still like to see those personnel records," Davidson said, his hand unconsciously moving toward his service weapon. "Of course," Williams replied. "They're in my office. Why don't you follow me?" They walked deeper into the forest along a path that seemed to wind away from the main park facilities. Davidson's unease grew with each step, but he forced himself to maintain professional composure despite his growing certainty that something was very wrong with Ranger Williams. "You know," Williams said conversationally as they walked, "I've always admired law enforcement officers. The dedication to protecting others, the willingness to investigate dangerous situations despite personal risk. Part of the job," Davidson replied, though his hand remained near his weapon. "Indeed. But sometimes investigations lead to discoveries that are difficult to accept. Truths that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality." They had stopped walking, Davidson realized, though he couldn't remember when. They were standing in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, but somehow the path they'd followed had disappeared. In every direction, the forest looked identical, offering no clue about which way led back to civilization. "Where are we?" Davidson demanded. "Somewhere between your world and mine," Williams replied, his voice beginning to change in subtle ways. "A place where the boundaries grow thin, where things that shouldn't exist can maintain their presence in your reality." Williams began to change, but slowly, as if savoring the process. His human features shifted and flowed like wax melting in reverse, revealing something underneath that belonged in nightmares rather than national forests. The thing that had been wearing Williams' face grew taller, its limbs extending in directions that defied human anatomy. Its skin became translucent, revealing structures underneath that might have been organs or might have been something else entirely. Most horrifying of all were its eyes, which multiplied and migrated across its shifting features like living things with their own agenda. "Yith, Og, then," the creature said, its voice now a harmony of sounds that included Williams' familiar tone mixed with frequencies that made Davidson's teeth ache. "That is my true name, though your language lacks the proper consonants to pronounce it correctly." Davidson drew his weapon, but the creature made no aggressive moves. Instead, it seemed to be studying him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. "I came to your world in 1963, it continued, "when my ship suffered catastrophic damage during a routine survey mission. The crash destroyed my vessel and stranded me on a planet I had only intended to observe." "What do you want?" Davidson managed to ask, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. Initially, survival. Your world's atmosphere is toxic to my species, requiring constant adaptation to maintain biological function. The human form provides necessary camouflage while I gather resources for eventual departure. The creature's features continued to shift and flow, occasionally resolving into William's familiar face before dissolving into something else entirely. But over the decades, I've developed an appreciation for your species. Such interesting variations in consciousness, such complex emotional responses to fear and pain. The missing people, Davidson said. You've been taking them, studying them. The creature corrected. Your kind's neural patterns provide valuable data about consciousness under stress. Each specimen has taught me something new about the boundaries between sanity and madness. You're experimenting on them. I am learning from them. There is a difference, though perhaps not one that matters from your perspective. The creature's laugh was a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. Would you like to see my collection, Sheriff? 40 years of careful research? Without waiting for an answer, the creature began moving toward what appeared to be solid rock face. As they approached, Davidson saw that what he'd taken for natural stone formation was actually some kind of camouflaged entrance. My ship, the creature explained. Damaged but not destroyed. It has served as laboratory and repository for my work. Beyond the entrance lay a corridor that belonged to no earthly architecture, its walls curving in directions that hurt to look at directly. The lighting came from no visible source, casting shadows that moved independently of any physical obstruction. In chambers branching off from the main corridor, Davidson saw them, the missing people, or what remained of them. Some were suspended in transparent containers filled with luminous fluid. Others had been modified in ways that suggested the creature's idea of improvement didn't align with human concepts of mercy. They were alive, Davidson realized with mounting horror. All of them were still alive, their eyes tracking his movement with expressions that suggested they remained conscious despite their transformations. Magnificent, isn't it? The creature said with obvious pride. Each specimen represents years of careful study. I've learned to extend their consciousness far beyond normal human limitations, allowing for extended observation periods. Davidson raised his weapon again, but the creature moved faster than thought, covering the distance between them before the sheriff could pull the trigger. Cold, impossibly strong fingers closed around his throat, cutting off both breath and blood flow. You would make an excellent addition to my collection, the creature whispered with William's voice. A law enforcement officer's neural patterns would provide fascinating comparison data. As consciousness faded, Davidson's last coherent thought was a prayer that someone would eventually find this place and expose the horror it contained. But in his heart, he knew that the creature was too careful, too patient, to allow such discoveries. The thing that called itself Yithog then had been perfecting its camouflage for 4 decades, and it had no intention of allowing one human investigator to interfere with its research. Chapter 5. The Discovery. Dr. Sarah Chen had come to Blackwood National Forest in October 2008 as part of a geological survey team investigating unusual mineral formations that satellite imagery had detected deep in the restricted zones. As a xenogeologist who specialized in impact craters and meteoric deposits, she was accustomed to finding evidence of cosmic visitors embedded in Earth's crust. But nothing had prepared her for what she would discover in the hidden depths of the forest. The readings were wrong from the beginning. Her equipment detected metallic compositions that didn't match any known terrestrial elements, arranged in patterns that suggested artificial construction rather than natural formation. When Ranger Williams offered to guide her team to the source of the anomalous readings, Every scientific instinct she possessed screamed warnings. "The area you're interested in is quite remote," Williams said, studying the printouts from Sarah's electromagnetic scanners. "Very few people have ever seen it. The terrain is challenging, and there are environmental hazards that require special precautions." Sarah noted that Williams never seemed to age. The personnel files indicated he'd been chief ranger since 1963, which would make him at least 70 years old, but he appeared to be in his 40s. When she'd mentioned this discrepancy, he'd simply smiled and attributed his youthful appearance to clean mountain air and regular exercise. "What kind of environmental hazards?" asked Dr. Peterson, Sarah's research partner. "Unstable ground conditions," Williams replied without hesitation. "Underground cave systems that extend much deeper than our surveys have been able to map. The metallic deposits you've detected are probably associated with old mining operations from the 1800s. But Sarah's equipment was specifically designed to distinguish between natural mineral formations and artificial constructions. What her scanners had detected was definitely not the result of 19th century mining. "We'll need to examine the site directly," she told Williams. "Take soil samples, conduct more detailed electromagnetic analysis." Williams was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. The area has been classified as environmentally sensitive. No excavation or sample collection is permitted." "Then what exactly are you offering to show us?" "Visual documentation only. I can guide you to a location where the formations are visible from a safe distance." Sarah exchanged glances with Peterson, both of them recognizing bureaucratic obstruction when they encountered it. But they'd driven 8 hours to reach Blackwood, and returning empty-handed would mean explaining their failure to the department chair who'd approved funding for the expedition. "All right," Sarah agreed. "When can we go?" "Tonight," Williams said immediately. "The formations are more visible after dark. Something to do with electromagnetic properties and ambient light conditions." That evening, Sarah and Peterson followed Williams along paths that didn't appear on any topographical map, deeper into the forest than either scientist felt comfortable venturing. Sarah's portable scanners showed increasingly strong readings as they traveled, suggesting they were approaching the source of the anomalous signals. "Just ahead," Williams said, pointing toward what appeared to be a sheer rock face rising from the forest floor. "The formations are embedded in that cliff face." But as they approached, Sarah realized that what she'd taken for natural stone was actually some kind of advanced composite material designed to mimic local geology. Her scanners were going crazy, detecting energy patterns that definitely weren't geological in origin. "This isn't a natural formation," she said, running her hands over the surface. "This is artificial construction disguised to look like rock." Williams stepped closer, no longer bothering to maintain his helpful ranger persona. "You're very perceptive, Dr. Chen, much more so than most of your species." "My species?" Peterson asked, but Williams was already changing. The transformation was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed, even in her worst nightmares. Williams' human features began to flow and reshape themselves, revealing something underneath that belonged to evolutionary paths Earth had never taken. His skin became translucent, showing internal structures that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. His limbs elongated and multiplied, ending in appendages that served functions Sarah couldn't begin to guess. "Yithog, then," the creature said, its voice now a harmony of frequencies that included ultrasonic components Sarah could feel in her bones. "Explorer of the cosmic deep, inadvertent resident of your primitive world." Peterson was screaming, his mind apparently unable to process what he was seeing. But Sarah, trained to observe and document even under extreme stress, found herself cataloging details with scientific precision. "You're not from Earth," she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Obviously not," the creature replied. "I arrived here in 1963 when my survey vessel experienced catastrophic systems failure. What you call meteor impact, I call very bad day." The false rock face was retracting, revealing an entrance that led into structures no human architect had ever conceived. The corridor beyond curved in directions that hurt to follow, its walls covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. "My ship," the creature explained, gesturing with appendages that bent in too many directions. "Damaged but functional enough to serve as laboratory and research facility." "Research into what?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Your species. 4 decades of careful study into human consciousness, neural plasticity, response to stress and modification." The creature's laugh was like crystal breaking in a hurricane. "I have collected 37 specimens for detailed analysis." They were deeper in the ship now, passing chambers that contained horrors Sarah's scientific training hadn't prepared her for. Humans in various stages of modification, their consciousness preserved in forms that suggested the creature's understanding of mercy was fundamentally alien. "You're experimenting on people," Peterson whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am learning from them," the creature corrected. "Their neural patterns provide valuable data about consciousness under extreme conditions. Each specimen has contributed to my understanding of your species' remarkable adaptability." In the central chamber, Sarah saw the heart of the creature's research. Banks of monitoring equipment that definitely wasn't terrestrial in origin surrounded transparent containers holding what had once been human beings. They were alive, their eyes tracking movement with expressions that suggested awareness despite their transformed state. "Magnificent, isn't it?" the creature said with obvious pride. "Consciousness preserved and enhanced, freed from the limitations of unmodified biology." Sarah recognized some of the faces from missing persons reports she'd seen over the years. The Martinez family from 1987, the Thompsons from 1993, Sheriff Davidson from 2003. All of them were still alive, still aware, trapped in states of existence that redefined the concept of suffering. "Why?" Sarah asked. "Why are you doing this?" "Knowledge," the creature replied. "Understanding. Your species represents the most complex consciousness I have encountered in 3 millennia of exploration. The variations in your neural patterns, the way your minds respond to fear and pain and hope, it's endlessly fascinating." Sarah's hand found the emergency transmitter in her jacket pocket, a device designed to send distress signals to search and rescue teams. But even as she activated it, she realized that help would never come. The creature was too careful, too patient, to allow its research to be discovered. "You would make an excellent addition to my collection," the creature said, moving closer with predatory grace. "A scientist's neural patterns would provide valuable comparison data." But Sarah was already moving, her years of fieldwork in dangerous terrain having taught her to always have an escape plan. She dove between the creature's elongated limbs, racing back toward the corridor that led to the surface. Behind her, the creature's roar of frustration echoed through the ship's alien architecture, a sound like tearing metal mixed with screaming winds. But it didn't pursue her immediately, perhaps confident that she couldn't escape its domain. Sarah ran through corridors that seemed to shift and change around her, following emergency lighting that might have been designed for human eyes, or might have been coincidence. The ship's damaged systems flickered and sparked around her, suggesting that 45 years of jury-rigged repairs were finally failing. She burst from the hidden entrance into the cool mountain air, her lungs burning and her legs threatening to collapse. But she forced herself to keep moving, following her own GPS beacon back toward the trailhead where their vehicle waited. Behind her, something vast and angry was stirring in the depths of the forest, but Sarah didn't look back. She reached their truck, started the engine, and drove toward civilization with the desperate hope that someone would believe her story. In her rearview mirror, she saw lights moving through the forest, pale and cold and definitely not human. The creature was abandoning its research facility, perhaps realizing that its decades of careful camouflage had finally been compromised. Sarah drove through the night, her hands shaking on the steering wheel as she tried to process what she'd witnessed. She had evidence on her scanners, electromagnetic readings that proved the existence of non-terrestrial technology. But she also knew that without physical proof, her story would be dismissed as hysteria or fabrication. When she finally reached cell phone coverage, Sarah called every authority she could think of: Park Service, FBI, military contacts from her government contract work. But by the time search teams arrived at the coordinates she provided, they found nothing but ordinary forest and natural rock formations. The creature that called itself Yithog then had vanished, taking its research and its victims to some new location where it could continue its work undisturbed. But Sarah knew it was still out there, still studying humanity with the patient curiosity of something that measured time in millennia rather than decades. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake with the certainty that pale eyes were watching her through her bedroom window, and she would remember the creature's final words as she fled its ship. "You cannot escape forever, Dr. Chen. I have learned patience from your species, and I have all the time in the world." The official reports listed the missing persons as victims of wilderness accidents, their disappearances attributed to the dangerous terrain and unpredictable weather conditions common to mountainous regions. Ranger Williams was transferred to another district, though no records of his new assignment were ever filed. And in the depths of some other forest, in some other remote location, something that wore a human face continued its research into the fascinating complexity of human consciousness, adding new specimens to its collection with the methodical patience of a creature that had been watching since 1963. Sarah Chen never returned to Blackwood National Forest, but sometimes, when she read news reports about missing hikers or unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas, she would check the details, looking for patterns, searching for signs that the patient predator had found a new hunting ground. Because she knew the truth that no one else would believe. Somewhere out there, wearing the face of a helpful park ranger or friendly guide, an alien intelligence continued its decades-long study of human nature. And it would keep collecting specimens until it finally learned everything it wanted to know about the species that had unwillingly become its laboratory subjects. The creature was still watching, still learning, still hungry for knowledge that could only be gained through methods too horrible for civilized minds to contemplate. And Sarah Chen, the only person who had seen its true face and lived to tell about it, could never be certain whether she had truly escaped or simply been allowed to flee as part of some larger experiment she couldn't begin to understand.